Chapter 2, Mishnah 2. The Mishnah discusses the status of fruit pits. All fruit pits are considered yados, and they therefore become tame along with the fruits to which they are attached. And they make those fruits tame when tuma touches them, but they do not combine with the fruits to make up the minimum size needed to transmit tuma to other foods and liquids. Date pits are an exception to this rule. The pits of a moist, i.e. fresh date, even if it is partially sticking out of the date, combines with the edible part of the date to make up the minimum size. This is because it is considered a shomer of the date and not just a yad. But the pit of a dry date does not combine with the date to make up the minimum size needed to transmit tuma because it is not a shomer. Once the date has dried out, the pit no longer preserves it. At this point, the date pit is no different from any other fruit pit, and its tuma status is that of a yad, which does not combine with the fruit to make up the minimum measure. Therefore, the membrane that surrounds the pit of the dry date combines with the date to make up that measure, even though the pit itself does not combine with the date. But the membrane around the pit of a moist date does not combine with the date to make up the measure, even though the pit does combine with the date. In a moist state, the pit prevents the inside of the date from falling apart, whereas the membrane does not contribute to this function. The membrane is therefore not regarded as a shomer. However, in a dry date, the pit is not needed to prevent the date from falling apart and does not serve as a shomer. The membrane, however, which in a dry date is stuck to both the pit and the fruit itself, does help protect the inside of the date, and it is therefore considered a shomer. The Mishnah now teaches the law for the pit of a partially eaten date. In the case of a pit of a moist date where part of the pit sticks out of the date because part of the date was eaten, only the part of the pit that is opposite the food, i.e. still within the date, combines with the food, the remainder of the date, to make up the minimum measure needed to transmit tuma. But the part that is sticking out of the food does not combine with it. Since that part does not protect the inside of the date, it does not combine with it for the minimum measure needed to transmit tuma. Like a pit in fruit, a meat bone can also be a shomer for the meat in which it is embedded. The Mishnah states the rule for a meat bone. Similarly, in the case of a bone on which there is meat, only the part of the bone that is opposite the food, i.e. covered with meat, is considered a shomer of the meat and combines with it to make up the minimum measure. But the part that is not covered with meat does not. If the meat was on only one side of the bone, i.e. the meat did not surround the bone but was attached to it only on one side of it, Rabbi Ishmael says we view it as if the meat surrounds the bone in a ring. That is, if there is enough meat attached to the bone to form a narrow ring around it, if it were cut into strips, then the entire thickness of the bone where the meat is located combines with the meat to form the minimum needed to transmit tuma. But the sages say only the part of the bone that is opposite the food, i.e. a thin layer of bone that is actually covered by the meat, combines with the meat to form the minimum measure. The Mishnah now gives a similar rule for certain other foods. The law of a bone that sticks out of the meat and of a pit that sticks out from a moist date applies to other things as well, like wild rosemary, hyssop, and savory. The items of these plants are shomrim for their edible leaves. The stems of these plants are shomrim for their edible leaves and are subject to the same law. Only the part of the stem that is next to the edible leaf has the status of a shomer and combines with it to form the minimum size needed to transmit tuma. The rest of the stem is not considered a shomer.